Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code Omnipoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the top 10 decks in the Black Bolt and White Flare expansion. This is the same format as the World Championship, so we have the perfect battleground to look at what some of the best players of the world were playing and building. So we're going to talk about that, talk about how the world's results adapt to the metagame as well, in terms of tech cards and other things involved in that. Because, of course, the locals are underway already for the 2026 season, and regionals across the globe are right around the corner, with Frankfurt and Monterrey happening very soon, as well as Pittsburgh. So all sorts kicking off, and a great way to start the 2026 season is with a strong regional performance. So let's get into our top 10. Now, I'm using a lot of the matchup data from TrainerHill.com today, which is the online tournament data, but I also want to point out that Labs.Limitless TCG is another fantastic resource to look at win rates. The reason why I've gone with Trainer Hill this time around, because there are some like 2 and 1% played decks at Worlds that only had a handful of games that made the matchup data look really, really swingy and odd. And that was because there were some breakout deck lists at the World Championships, whereas the Trainer Hill data is capturing from the 18th of August onwards to the 2nd of September. So it's all knee-jerk reacting to the World Championships, meaning that when we look at the end Zoroark results, or when we look at the Gholdengo Joltik results, it's much more games behind those decks with the list that we expect. So I feel like we just have a greater volume of data to snapshot from Trainer Hill as we do Limitless Labs. But if you want to look at a high-level overview of players playing at the top level, obviously these are all Worlds competitors facing up against each other, it might paint a different picture. So as we go through the matchup data, I'm holding my hands up. Some of this data may look odd at times, but it's just what Trainer Hill spits out. So we're going to discuss that all as we go. Starting off, let's look at what were the most popular decks in the World Championships as well as on the online scene since the World Championships, because this might give us a good indication of what decks it's important to tech against and be aware of in terms of what matchups to target. So Gholdengo EX was very popular at day one of the World Championships at 22.5%, followed up by Dragapult Dusknoir, which is also the most popular online right now, at only 11% in the online scene, but 17% in the World Championships. Much, much more popular than the regular Dragapults as well as the Dragapult Charizard. So it feels like the Dusknoir is really coming out on top in droves for the most part, and that's also the case as the Dragazard and Straight Pult are outside of the top 10 in terms of popularity in the online scene as well. Then we have Gardevoir. Of course, it won the World Championship, so that also might boost its percentage going into the first set of tournaments. Raging Bolt, an ever-present threat. Charizard is picking up in popularity online, and I think that's in part because of the great results at the World Championships. It's actually the 5th most played online right now, whereas at Worlds it was a little bit lower down at just 3.9%. Grimmsnarl still in the conversation. Joltik plus Gholdengo, the cash-in-hand deck, as I'm still trying to coin that phrase, is also picking up in popularity. Of course, it won the seniors division in a high-profile game up against Gabriel Fernandez that a lot of people watched, and that's now at 4.3%. And I think it might be stealing some meta share away from the regular Joltik box, which you can see down languishing at 14th now in the online scene, whereas it was more popular than Joltik Dengo at the World Championship. So that seems to be a bit of a flip-flop now. A lot of people moving away from the pure basic build and saying that Joltik only need to power up one Pikachu or one Iron Hands, and then Dengo can follow up with attacks for the remainder of the game. You don't have to rely on Crispin so much for your basic attacking suite. Those seem to be the big changes. Zoroark still not that popular, even though it had some great high-profile placements at Worlds. Flareon still in that conversation as well. It looks like Crustle kind of dropping off after a very mediocre performance at the World Championships. So those are the main talking points that we're going to discuss today in terms of what decks are important to beat and be aware of in terms of popularity, because it does seem like the online data has shifted based on those Worlds results, with Charizard picking up, Dengo Joltik, and a bit of Zoro. Maybe not as much Zoro as I expected. I would have figured it would have been more popular, but there we are. Let's get into some decks then. Starting off with Tera Box. This really wasn't that popular at the World Championships, but it did manage a top 32 placement, which is really impressive for a deck that's been on the fringes for a while. But as we know, this deck is still very capable at forcing 2 prize cards out of opponents. Early game torrential pumps can be devastating for evolving archetypes. We know that it has a couple strong type coverages with Clefairy, with some grass types in there, whether it's Leafeon EX or Teal Mask Ogerpon EX. And we know that there's that catch-all of Pikachu as well, which is generic high damage output into Dengo and Zoroark. And neither of those Pokemon have easy ways to get around Resolute Heart either. So that's really appealing for the archetype. Looking at the matchups, the only really poor matchup is the Joltik Box, and it also struggles a little bit into straight Dragapult, Flareon, Gardevoir, and the Gholdengo Joltik, basically saying that Iron Hands is a big problem for this deck by the looks of things. And also Gardevoir, one of the few EX Pokemon that can, avoid the type coverage that Tera Box tries to go for, so it can sit out of range at times. Flareon, quite a similar engine, so they both compete for which player gets to go first. And Flareon also known for playing Briar as well, so Tera Box being so good at carving out a 2-2-2 then falls prey to the Briar situation of a Flareon. And the straight Dragapult should be a little bit more difficult than it seems to be coming out, but I guess just the consistency at the disposal of Dragapult is a problem, and there's also backdoor win conditions of Maractus, so that might be the reason why it's slightly unfavored. The bigger boast for Tera Box is the Charizard matchup. Again, you have Grass-type coverage, and you have early game Wellspring, which is strong. Seems to be pretty good into the Dragadusk, which is kind of intriguing when the Dragazard and the regular Dragapult are more even or unfavorable, so maybe just Dragadusk is a little bit less consistent or can't afford to use its Dusknoirs because it forfeits too many prizes in the opening stages, but also looking pretty solid into Grimmsnarl as well, which is quite an appealing boast. Let's have a look at the list that Alex Szymanski created for that top 32 finish at the Worlds, getting a cool 5k. Having the 1-1 count of the Leafeon EX is a really cool addition, actually, giving you a more secure option into Grimmsnarl, Dragapult, and Charizard as well. Whereas the Teal Mask Ogopon, it requires E-Switch, Crispin, attachment combinations. It's a big combo to get that going, and it's easily just knocked out in response a lot of the time, even in things like Grimmsnarl with just some Monkey Dory damage and whatnot. Whereas the Leafeon has the Verdant Storm, which is a very easy, Crispin and I attack that can take a knockout. It has higher hit points, and it also has the means of healing as well into Dragapult when you're not necessarily able to reach KOs in between turns of using like Clefairy, for example. You can have this option to just heal your guys that a Dragapult is trying to set up. So I think that's a really cool combination in the deck and a really well-identified package worth playing from Alex. I think the debate is like, if you're already playing Leafeon, should you be playing Flareon anyway? Because Flareon could also very much squeeze in the Ogopon package with Crystal. So I think that's the small debate I'm having, is like, is Tera Box truly better than Flareon that has slightly better results? Especially if you're going to yoink the Leafeon part anyway, we could just go thicker on that evolution package and have a few other boasts in here. But if you are looking to play the Tera Box version, this is the list that I would be going for. I really like what Alex has done with this one. In at number 9, then, we have Grimmsnarl. Bit of a fall from grace, actually, since the Destined Rivals format. It doesn't seem to be enjoying the amount of Gholdengo in our meta. These are both really poor matchups, both the Hands build and the regular build of Gholdengo. And also Tera Box is a new weak matchup on your radar. Also not great into the Flareon. Again, there's that Leafeon popping up in both of those builds. And Raging Bolt continues to be a bit of a thorn in the side. But Grimmsnarl still has some big boasts to it. Very good into Gardevoir, which is one of the few decks in the format that can say that. It likes the new pickup of Zoroark. It's pretty decent into the Joltik Box, and it's pretty decent into Dragapult as well, whilst being even into all Dragapult builds. So you're at least even into all the Pults, which is pretty appealing, and okay into Charizard as well. So it's really Gholdengo that's holding this deck back right now. Possibly some tech inclusions could be worthwhile, whether it's going to be Ace Nullifier Genesect, or whether it's Toadscruel, or Cornerstone, or some sort of tech that you could add into Grimmsnarl to try and balance that. I think that's the only thing I could really consider right now, because just the regular strategy of setting up a Devo play or just monkeying up math to fit the 260 threshold, that's just not getting the job done right now into the Gholdengos. And that's the big reason holding back Grimmsnarl from top places. But at the World Championships, we saw plenty of archetypes were willing to concede spaces to purely tech for Dengo. And as soon as you do that, Grimmsnarl has a really good matchup spread. So it wouldn't surprise me if we started to see that trend of Grimmsnarl saying, well, I'm okay into the Pulse, I'm really good into Guardi. If I just fix that Dengo, I'm a really good deck again. Let's have a look at the top 64 placement at the World Championships from Aaron Curry here then. This is a really standard build of Grimmsnarl. Nothing that we haven't seen before, to be honest with you. Of course, including the Air Balloon from the latest expansion is really the only thing it needs to add. And it seems like a very straightforward, safe build. Now, the one thing I would sort of gesture is maybe it is worth that Toadscruel, or possibly it's worth going to like second Air Balloon and fitting Ace Nullifier Genesect. These are some things that I'm considering, because if the first Grimmsnarl can tank a Dengo hit, for example, then the game completely pivots on its head. You gain so much damage, and you gain an extra turn, which is always a huge benefit. And also you could consider the the Toedscruel to do a similar thing, but just in the late game, and say that a Grimmsnarl late is going to tank on this board as long as the Toedscruel is there. So these are some things I'm thinking about. The one thing I then caveat with that is that a lot of the Gholdengos are trying to prepare for Toedscruel because it was so popular at the World Championships, whether they're having some prize cheating mechanics from the likes of Togekiss in the list, or like Briar with Ceruledge, these sorts of combinations. Those are things that could still trip you up, but I do think trying to service that Gholdengo matchup is the big puzzle piece missing for Grimmsnarl right now. In at number 8, we have Zoroark. This had some really highlight reel performances for a deck that was so unpopular. Of course, it did get an NAIC top 8, and that sort of straight build, just relying on Reshiram and Turos and sponging, was a big driving force at Worlds here. Obviously, getting second in the Seniors Division as well as a couple of top 8 placements is a huge overperformance for such an unpopular pick. And you can see why, actually. It's good into the 2 core Stage 2s of our meta. Dragapult and Gardevoir both being strong matchups is a really great thing for this archetype, and the main thing holding this deck up, I would say, as a really strong pick right now. However, as you can see, there are also some glaring issues with the deck. There's no doubt we are trying to dodge and weave with Zoroark. Charizard is difficult. Flareon can just completely churn through you, as can a Gholdengo Joltik deck, which is significantly more difficult than a straight Gholdengo, because the Zoroarks are often teching Cornerstone and or Toedscruel, most likely going towards the Toedscruel package that we saw with TM Evolution. Whereas if there's a Joltik build of Dengo, they can lean into the Pikachu, they can lean into Iron Hands, and they're not too phased by the Toedscruel overall. So that's a much, much more awkward matchup, and that's completely popped up since Worlds, so that's a big concern for the Zoroark players. It's also weak into regular Joltik Box and not great into Raging Bolt either. So definitely some work to be done with Zoroark. You can see why it's still an outsider pick, but if you get on that track towards the top tables, you hit more and more of these Stage 2 decks, and the Zoroark can have a really, really clean run. I do personally think that with Joltik, Dengo picking up in popularity and Charizard as well after impressing at Worlds, that's a concern for me for Zoroark. So it may have just been a cute metagame call for Worlds itself, and already, now that it's become a known entity, we might have to put it back in the binder for a bit until the metagame shifts again. That's just my personal take, but I do think the list that was constructed for the World Championships was absolutely exceptional. Gabrielle and Marco coming up with this deck list together in the Seniors Division, getting second, top 8 in Masters, the same 60, shows that it has a lot of strength behind it. The Toedscruel is such a cute tech card to help out against Dragadusk, as well as helping out against Raging Bolt and the Gholdengo matchup, of course, being the primary reason it's in the deck. But a lot of versatility just from this one Stage 1 evolution line. You have burst potential with Janine's to allow you to Petra late on, and you have that Blood Moon as well. You even have the Binding Mochi that can combine with Subjugating Chains or Janine to push Zoroark to KO. Pokemon with 210 hit points, most likely Pheasantipity being a key option there, but also Monkey Dora can help out also to push into basic EXs just generally. So I do think this deck does what it attempts to do quite well. It's just that there's an even more volatile matchup now. Whereas Toedscruel was great into regular Gholdengo, if there are going to be builds with Iron Hands as well, then it just becomes much more prickly, I would say. Speaking of which, getting into number 7, then we have Joltik Box. This deck is still looking pretty appealing, to be honest with you. It has slight unfavourables into Joltik Dengo and regular Gholdengo, and it also is a little bit weak into the Grimmsnarl, but it's pretty good into a lot of the other decks in the format, quite good into some of these Dragapult builds, the Dusknoir being the closest of the bunch. Pretty good into the Zoroark deck, good into Flareon, decent into Gardevoir, and decent into Tera Box as well, with balanced times into Charizard, Dragadusk, and Raging Bolt. The one thing that sticks out to me is that I would have thought the Raging Bolt matchup would be more difficult, but there are a number of players opting to go opting to go Koraidon over Slitherwing, and again at the World Championships we saw more builds have Koraidon than Slither. I do think because Pikachu EX is showing up in the new Gholdengo Joltik that there's going to be a movement back to Slither, and I think generally the West has been more popular with Slither anyway. So I do think that we've kind of inflated the win rate right now, whereas I think it is going to be a much weaker matchup heading into our next set of regionals. But just a small thing there, the only thing that really sticks out is that I think Raging Bolt is one of your weaker matchups generally. But let's have a look at a deck list then. This was a top 64 placing list of the Joltik deck. That's just the straight up basic build with that one Galvantula in there. Interesting suite of tools with the Brave Bangle for Galvantula, the Power Glass so you can churn through with Pikachu. Very good into the Zoroark and Dengo matchups, so a well-identified option there. The Lively Stadium is one you don't always expect, but with double Bravery Charm plus Lively, it makes it so difficult for the initial Iron Hands to be dealt with, and for the likes of Dragapult and Gardevoir that want to do such specific math, sometimes the Lively Stadium and the Bravery Charms can just push them out of range, and you can surprise your opponent with a win condition that your opponent thought the game was locked up, but suddenly a stadium can throw their math off that little bit. And a lot of these stage 2s are only playing 2 stadium cards, and it's an extra piece they have to find on top of everything else. So yeah, it's an interesting stadium I wasn't expecting to see in the list. Also, not seeing Iono at all in the deck is a bit worrying. Also, not seeing that 4th Pokegear, I think, still really important just to get into the game. But some cute tech cards nonetheless. I think double Bravery Charm without the stadium is reasonable, or just 1 charm, no stadium, or 1 charm, 1 stadium is also like okay as well. But generally, it's the same thing that we've seen from the Joltik Box for a while, and yeah, pretty strong performance. Of course, I also have to mention the sort of newcomer in the format, the Cash in Hand deck. Again, I'm going to keep beating that drum, so get on board with this deck name. But I think this deck has incredible online data. We have slightly weaker times into some of the Dragapult builds, the Straight Pult and the Dragazard, but you gain the better Dragapult Dusknoir, which is pretty appealing actually. I think that's the one you would rather target right now. So you flip-flopped your matchups there. You're a little bit weak into regular Zard. I think both the Dragazard and the regular Zard obviously have Chi-Yu, which can be a headache. And just generally Charizard can do a nice 2-2-2 into you if you get aggressive with your Iron Hands early, and they're going to be the ones constantly disrupting with Iono and whatnot, forcing the Dengo to draw off Fez, draw off Dengo, and find multiple Superiors and Levincias and whatnot. So you can see why those are fairly unfavorable. Even into the Flareon, even into Raging Bolt is pretty appealing, but just look at the amount of good matchups up here. Very good into Gardevoir, Grimmsnarl, and Zoroark. That strong Dragadusk is another big boast. Good into the mirror match as well. The straight Dengo has an awkward time into this matchup because the Iron Hands is so good at brute forcing that 2-prize knockouts, and the regular Gholdengo doesn't have an easy means of taking the first 2 prizes. I think regular Dengo has to start working in Iron Bundle as a staple now, actually, because it's way too easy for the Cash in Hand deck to just go Jolting Charge, have a board of just your Iron Hands and Miraidon and whatnot. Obviously, if they have the gimmies as well, that's still a bit of a write-off, but that's one of your only ways that Gholdengo can bundle plus ESP and take the first 2. Because, you know, the counter catchers won't be live. It's really hard to have ESP plus boss. You don't play enough vessels to just naturally grab enough energy to get through the first multi-prizer. It's very easy for Gholdengo to take the first 2 prize knockouts with Iron Hands, and then the regular Dengo is kind of just like floundering from there. So I think Bundle could be a good tech inclusion. Obviously, again, if they get Gimme Ghouls down in addition to everything else, like they need to sometimes get Lati plus Miraidon plus Joltik plus Hands. Like a lot of their early ball search is not based to Gimme Ghouls, so I think Bundle could be important, but I think just having a good time into the regular Dengo is a big, big deal right now. So I think the Cash in Hand deck is going to be real for sure. It's also solid into the regular Joltik Box and Tera Box as well. So everything's looking breezy online for this deck. And it did get that first place finish in the Seniors Division. Also had a couple of decent Day 2 placements at the Masters Division as well. Now, for Guan's list, I think there's a lot right here. There's a lot that's absolutely spot on. But I do think the Petrol stands out as a slightly weaker card. I also think you can get away by cutting Bravery Charm altogether. I think you can also basically just try and bolster your Pokegears and Brock's counts. I think those are the most important things I've had through testing. Obviously, Bravery Charm is good to push yourself out of range with Iron Hands just so it can sit on the board that little bit easier. But also this deck is so good at just doing 1 amp, then make it rain, make it rain. It's so frequent that that is going to be your 3-attack strategy. And especially with Jamming Tower index and Tool Scrapper index, I don't love the Bravery Charm so much. I think extra gear, extra Brock, when you take away Petrol Charm and just say that if I get Jolting Charge, my deck is insane, I think that's just a great thing to have for the list. But overall, I think this is a really, really well-constructed build, and it has great logic behind it that's just difficult for the format to deal with. We know that Iron Hands is a menace and keeps anyone honest, and we know that Gholdengo has a great, great late game. And the combination of the two, especially with Pikachu trying to stitch that together as well, to be like, if my opponent's teching for the Dengo part, I at least have Pika for high damage. I think this actually covers a lot of the format, and even though it's a very simplistic deck and your win rate plummets when you're forced to go first, and when you are whiffing your Brock or your Arven or whatnot, your win rate obviously plummets because you whiff that Jolting, and then suddenly the whole thing comes crashing down because you really rely on pulling energy out with Joltik to then use as your reservoir once your Pikachu's attacked or once Iron Hands is knocked out, then your Superiors and Levincias become live. That's the big core concept of the deck, so got to make sure you're on all cylinders. So I think just bolstering that Brock and gear count is going to be the most important way to improve your win rate with this deck, but the online data is looking really, really good for it, to be honest. Moving on to Flareon then, and this looks to be the 50-50 deck of the format by the looks of things. Lots of balanced matchups into the Stage 2s, into Gholdengo, into Raging Bolt and Tera Box. So that's a lot of even matchups you're having to take. That might be a sign that Flareon is a tie trap, or might be a sign that it has a lack of consistency right now because it's trying to fit so much into a wide format. That's the thing that's like kind of good about the deck, in that you're not worried about any matchup you come up against, but you don't really have an easy time into anything. You've got to be playing perfectly the whole time and draw reasonably well throughout the entire time, surviving Ionos, surviving Judges, making sure you still have Jewel Seeker online, that sort of thing. That's the big hiccup, I think, for Flareon for the most part, to have any really reliable, strong matchups. Bar Zoroark. Zoroark can't deal with Cardelian, and it can't deal with Leafeon very easily either, so that matchup is a banker. You're a little bit weak into Joltik Box and a little bit weak into the Dragazard and regular Dragapult. Interestingly enough, the Dusknoir makes it easier for you. I imagine that can help you work towards a Briar Wing condition or something along those lines if they're not careful. Or again, they just have to juggle too many pieces, and it can end up benefiting you a little bit more than a straight Pult that just gets into more games. So yeah, Flareon, pretty balanced into the format, has answers to a lot, but doesn't really have too many boasts in the game right now. Let's have a look at the top 8 list from the Seniors Division there from Isu, and it's going to be a pretty straightforward list. It does have Leafeon and Sylveon in addition to the Clefairy, and it is also playing the Wellspring, which I think is a really good choice right now. Sometimes you can completely rug pull some of these Stage 2s with the early Torrential Pump, and not many of these lists are committing spaces to Shaman whatsoever, so I do think that's looking pretty okay. But it's what we've seen previously with the Flareon deck, to be honest. I think one card I'd love to throw in is a Cyrano. That's one of the only things that I would try and look to work into the list, but beyond that, I'm looking pretty happy about this build overall. I like the Briar. It doesn't play Terrapagos, and I think Terrapagos does make the Briar that little bit stronger, but I think you can still get the job done with your evolutions as well, so not a mandatory inclusion by any means. In at number 5, we have the return of Charizard. This was low-key one of the big winners of the World Championships. It surprised a number of people. Of course, it did well in the hands of Gabriel Fernandez at the Seniors Division, and it seemed like the metagame was just getting into a decent enough spot for this deck. The risk, of course, is that you're still weak into Dragapult. There's no doubt that you're taking a risk bringing Charizard to these tournaments, because Dragapult is one of the top decks in the room, always going to be one of the top 3 in popularity, and you know that you have to dodge these matchups or have good variants into these matchups to win them. And that was the case for some of our Charizard players at Worlds as well. Some of the players like Irvin, who made top 8, did manage to only face one Dragapult, lost to it, and then beat other things in the format. So that's a small caveat here, that there is big risk with Charizard right now. I think the upshot is, well, Zoroark's a nice new matchup for you, but also the Gholdengo matchup is pretty okay, which is looking nice. Again, you have Briar, you have Chi-Yu, you have Charizard, which is genuinely just a big threat. So you have a few answers in that matchup, and you're going to be the one in control of Iono for the most part. You're solid into Gardevoir, Flareon, Dragazard, Dengo, Hands, Grimmsnarl, and Joltik Box as well. The matchup data is not too appealing, honestly, for Charizard. I thought it would look better with just that caveat that Dragapult's quite bad. Honestly, you would expect the Gardevoir matchup to look more favourable. However, that's not what the data's suggesting right now. I also think it would be a bit better into Joltik Dengo as well, just similar to regular Dengo, with Iron Hands taking 2, and then you can instantly Burning Darkness it back. But I suppose it forces you to draw perfectly the entire time to keep up with these things. The one thing I will say as well is that Charizard is now a 3 Stage 2 deck, with Dusknoir making its way back into the majority of the successful lists, and that does also eat into consistency, which you have to bear in mind. Let's have a look at Junior's 4th place list. I really like the build, to be honest with you. I like the Cleffa in here. I like the Maximum Belt as the A spec, even though we know that the Secret Box is a good consistency booster. I don't believe in the Mesagoza quite so much, so I think Max Belt, just that you can push through those Dragapults, is important. And bear in mind, Junior was able to beat a number of the Dragapult opponents they faced at Worlds. And obviously we weren't there to watch everything and see how it all played out, but I have to imagine that with Dusknoir and Max Belt in the list, you're at least giving yourself a chance to Burning Darkness through some of these Dragapults as you go through the game, whereas Irvin basically immediately lost on the spot by playing Secret Box and having no real answer. By playing Max Belt, Dusknoir, and Mist, you're giving yourself a decent shot of actually still beating that Dragapult matchup. So I think Juniors is the list to look at, and the one that we should be looking towards playing towards our first few sets of regionals. And I also like the 4-2-3 line of Charizard, very thick line. It makes the TM evolution look good. And just honestly, you want multiple Charmander every game. So in addition to your Poffins, it means that as long as you have a Charmander, you can Poffin for Pidgey Charm, or if you have double Charm, you can go Pidgey Dusk, and that's when the deck starts looking really good. Obviously, you weave in Cleffa a lot as well. So these are all things to bear in mind. The 4 Charmander looking really good in my opinion. In at number 4 then, we have Gardevoir, the winning deck, of course, in the hands of Riley McKay, but ultimately didn't have a good day 1 to 2 conversion. In fact, didn't have a fantastic Worlds overall, just, of course, having that headline of, oh, Gardevoir won again, Gardevoir's so broken. But that's not actually the case, and I also think the online data is suggesting that, sure, a handful of very qualified Guardy players can do well with the archetype, provided the right run, but it's actually quite a volatile format for Gardevoir right now. Gholdengo seems to be a tricky matchup. Grimmsnarl and Zoroark also continue to be awkward matchups. You're also slightly unfavourable into Zard builds, including the Dragazard, and also not enjoying the Joltik Box either. Your only real boast is Tera Box, which isn't really even an archetype right now, and you're only even into Dragapult and Dragadusk. Now, I think that's harsh. I think you should be, if you're going to be targeting anything, your target should be the Dragapult deck. So I'm surprised that the data is spitting out that they're basically just even matchups. But I do think Dragapult loses that matchup more than it wins or ties. So I do think it's looking a little bit harsh for the Guardy data. But hey, I'm just holding my hands up. This is what the Trainer Hill data says. Don't shoot the messenger. I know that I would rather be the Gardevoir player than the Dragapult player for sure. So just take that with a pinch of salt, and the overall traffic lights would look more appealing if you expect the Dragapult matchup to be favoured. Also, even into Flareon and into the Raging Bolt as well. Again, I think the data is a little bit tough on Gardevoir here, whereas I think I would, again, much prefer to be the Guardy side than the Raging Bolt side. I think those are generally your quite favoured matchups. So I do think there's a bit of a juggle with Gardevoir. I think you like seeing the dragons. I think the dark stuff and Gholdengo are generally a little bit poor. But of course, we're going to be looking at Riley's first place list. Very well constructed list, very consistent, has the right elements of attacking threats, has, of course, that big lean into Monkey Dory Dark, which is, as we know, just completely devastating and backbreaking. And I think, no doubt, this is going to be the formula for most Gardevoirs going forward. In at number 3, then, we have Raging Bolt. Raging Bolt has a decent Zoroark matchup, also enjoys seeing Charizard coming back in the format, is solid into Grimmsnarl and Straight Bolt, even into Dragadusk, Flareon, Gholdengo and Cash in Hand, as well as the Joltik Box, and its unfavourables slightly are the Charizard Dragapult, the Gardevoir, and the Tera Box. So, as expected, really, Raging Bolt has to be a little bit concerned about that Guardy matchup, but basically everything else you're happy to run into, making it a very consistent and easy pick for these major tournaments, knowing that you're at least in the game in most situations. Let's have a look at the top 4 place list that Shizuki had at the World Championships. Like I said, there's that debate always of Koraidon versus Slither. I think if the Joltik Cash in Hand deck is going to be more and more of a thing, I think you basically have to respect Pikachu as one of your only hurdles, to be honest, and it turns from an awkward card that you have to play around to a card you love to hit, because not only do you take that knockout, you do it with burn, so you don't even give your opponent Pheasantipity. It completely makes it like a huge win for you to see that card hit the board, and you give them basically no place to go, because we know that Joltik will choose to go second, Raging Bolt loves to go first as long as it's playing the Owl build, and you can turn to Jewel Seeker, try and Prime Catcher and Iron Hands if they power it up, or if they power up a Pikachu, in the best case scenario, you can Slither Wing through it, or you can always just Raging Bolt through something like a Miraidon or a Latias that they've had to put down, or a Genesect, take that 2-prize knockout knowing that you have Slitherwing to respawn on a Pikachu if that's the Pokemon that they powered up. So that immediately becomes a much, much better matchup for you as soon as you swap your fighting type Mon in the deck. I think that's the only real standout here. I think E-Switch isn't all that common. I think the Chien-Pao doesn't have to be played, although we know that it's decent. Some builds of Raging Bolt will play 2 Error Zero and 1 Jamming instead. That's also a reasonable choice, to be honest with you, just to move to your damaged Pokemon in a different capacity. Of course, there's the Turo in the deck as well. Iono versus Judge, that's still a debate. I'm still very much Team Judge, but I think Iono's solid as well. But yeah, a really solid baseline for Raging Bolt, and we know that you're always basically going to be playing a solid sort of 57 cards of the deck, and then there's 2 or 3 slots are up to you for creativity and for consistency if need be, or whatever else you want to do with the list, because things like Squawk aren't guaranteed. Second Crispin is common in the deck as well. What else have we got here? Sometimes an extra Night Stretcher, sometimes Blood Moon, sometimes Superior. These sorts of things can easily come into the list, even Sixth Grass Energy. These are all things that people debate and chop and change with the build, but this is a really good baseline, I think, for Bolt. In at number 2 then, we're going to be talking about Dragapult, and as you've seen with the matchup data, I've been talking about all 3 builds, so we're going to be going over the matchup data and deck lists for all 3 of these, even though the Dragadusk is way out in front in terms of popularity, and definitely the one that needs to be public enemy, I think, going into the next set of regionals as the build that you have to expect to see as soon as someone flips over a Dreepy. You've got to be thinking that Curse Blast is going to be in their list unless you're proven otherwise. And actually, for the first time in a long time, Dragapult has been dethroned because the combined point total of all 3 of these decks still are dwarfed by Gholdengo's success at the World Championships. So Dragapult finally in that 2nd place. Let's have a look at the Dragadusk data then. Does have a few fairly awkward matchups, Tera Box not being great. Not great into either of the Dengo lists. Not great into Gardevoir, of course. Also a little bit weak into Straight Pulse and Zoroark. And then you have a balanced time into Raging Bolt, Joltik, Grimm, Flareon, and Dragazard, with only your boast being Charizard. I think, again, this is harsh on the deck. I think there is like a high skill ceiling to Dragadusk, and I know that its consistency is somewhat of a concern compared to the other, well, certainly the straight build of Dragapult, but it still just has so much damage potential. I think it can take on basically the entirety of the format, and I think Justin proved that with their 2nd place finish here. A very well constructed list. No like excess cards in the deck at all, just trying to be bare bones, trying to do its main strategy as often as possible with that thick Pult line, a relatively thick Dust line, the double Budgie, like no nonsense here whatsoever. And even 2nd copy of Jamming Tower I think is a big deal. It means that whenever you do see Bravery Charms on site, you should have access to this card, but also you can try and just stick this early and deny TM Evo from Guardy players, and that's also a big part of your win condition. Throw the stadium down, Itchy Pollen, deny both Candy and Evo, and suddenly you'll give yourself a chance to Curse Blast, Counter Catch, Phantom Dive, take out multiple Rolts and Curliers so they can't get set up. That's your core win condition in the matchup, so I think that's a big deal, and this deck is looking really powerful in my books, and I think the matchup data, honestly, is looking really harsh for this deck. Going into a straight Dragapult then, it seems to be a bit varied with its own matchup data. Weak, very, very weak into the Zoroark, weak into the Joltik Box, and not great into the Dragazard either. Slight unfavored into Guardy, Grimm, and Raging Bolt, even into Dragadusk, even into Dengo, and even into Tera Box, with good times into Flareon, Joltik, Dengo, as well as that straight Charizard once again. Let's have a look at the top 32 list from Kato here. Very similar, or if not the same, as Tord's actual build going into the World Championships, where it has the Ethan Pseudo in addition to Maractus, and it also has the Cornerstone Ogerpon in here, trying to be a tech card that can allow you to attack through Crustle, but also being a means of trying to wall out Zoroark and Gholdengo players. So lots of pitfalls, lots of traps in the deck for your opponent to fall into. Of course, there's Luminous, so you can attack with that Cornerstone very, very easily, with just your handful of basic energy in the deck as well. Ethan Pseudo-Wudo, thanks to its fighting typing, can attack into lots of Pokemon that have fighting resistance, for example, Lati, and trap it infinitely, which is really nice. It also means that if you want to deal damage and you're trying to set up a Dragapult win condition rather than a pure stall, you can attack into Pokemon that have grass resistance with the Pseudo-Wudo and actually deal damage, whereas Maractus would deal 0, for example, into like a Genesect EX. The Pseudo can deal damage, setting you up for a Phantom Dive if that's the avenue you want to go for. So you have a couple of different avenues with this pair of corner trapping mons, and it also means, of course, if one's prized, you still have access to the other. So yeah, cool to see double trappers in here, especially with Grimmsnarl not always playing the Maractus. It's only really this deck that looks to corner trap things. And if Grimmsnarl's going down in play, there's less reason for Iron Leaves to be in deck lists, and then suddenly the corner traps, you know, again start getting there a lot of the time. So a cool list from Kato, and a few others also choosing to go with this list. Obviously, I think Tord was one of the core minds behind the 60, and it was able to go far, just unfortunately not in his hands. And then finally, Dragazard. This feels like the forgotten deck, to be honest. It was quite popular at the NAIC. Had some decent runs as well. Like, it had a number of ASIM placements. And it feels like it's just really not been picked up in popularity. A lot of people banking on the Dragadusk. And there's still the question mark of, like, you're quite weak into the Dragadusk matchup, which makes it hard to pick this deck. It also is showing as unfavored into Gholdengo, like the straight builds. I actually do want to contest this a little bit. I think with Chi-Yu, I think that matchup is really, really fine, if not even. Like, I'm actually quite happy as the Dragazard side. Like, I've played Dragazard a lot last season, and I've always been quite happy as the Dragazard side to face Gholdengo. I suppose the caveat being that Gholdengo is just so ruthlessly consistent now, sometimes it gets 2 prizes ahead while you sort of flounder with Dragazard, which can happen at times. But I'm surprised that matchup is looking unfavorable, especially when the Gholdengo Joltik is looking even. I think that's a better reflection, even though they have more threats in their deck. So just a small caveat there. Slightly unfavored into Grimmsnarl, also not enjoying that Zoroark too much, and Joltik Box regularly just being the weakest matchup of the bunch because they have both Leaves, Galvantula, and Clefairy, so they get the early Iron Hands and it's hard for you to stop them going 2-2 after that. Whereas your even matchups are Charizard, Flareon, Gardevoir, which is the only thing that can be said for this build of Dragapult compared to the others. Also even into Tera Box, and pretty okay into straight Dragapult and Raging Bolt as well. Again, that Chi-Yu tech card helpful, as well as, you know, Charizard just generally being very strong. Let's have a look at the top 64 placement from Changyi here, where there is one of each of the Charmeleons, which is not always the case. I think the 100 hit pointer is by far the best option, to be honest with you, but it does allow you to play around Devo that little bit, I suppose. I'm surprised by the stadium choice as well. I think Artisan's the one I've sat on for a long time, but Jamming Tower is still reasonable. Also, it's uncommon for you to see the Psychic Energy in the deck. Also uncommon to see Hilda. A lot of the time you just see 4th Luminous plus Research, and I think those would be my preferred choices, to be honest with you. But I do like Chi-Yu, Hawlucha, Monkey, Budew. Like, I love all the basics outside of the Charizard line. Sometimes you see it as just a 2-1-2 or a 3-1-2 line of Charizard. I think that's better than a 2-2-2, honestly, as well. So I would be shimmying around a couple of cards with this list, but it's actually still pretty close. Like, I don't like Hilda Psychic, I don't like Jamming, and I don't like the 90 hit point Charmeleon, but that's about it, really. I think also you don't need double Night Stretcher Rod. I think you can just go double Rod. So a few things you can shimmy around from my personal preference and a lot of testing with the deck, but I do think this should be more considered. I think it should be a closer call between Dragadusk and Dragazard going into these next few tournaments, knowing that Gardevoir is still a massive threat, knowing that Dengo is going to be really popular now, and this has like quite a solid game plan into it compared to like a straight Dragapult, for example. I think this could low-key be like waiting in the wings for another good performance, because we've seen Charizard was able to go just so far at Worlds, and this deck can still play as a Charizard deck. You know, you have Recon Directives just supporting Charizard in a lot of situations, and that's very similar to Charizard Pidgeot in a lot of ways. Obviously, there's not the same guarantees as Quick Search, but you at least get into every game with Recons, and this deck still plays really nicely as a Dragapult plus Monkey Dory deck, knowing that Charizard can just be an accelerator when it needs to as well, and it makes your Phantom Dive even more flexible, knowing that Burning Darkness could be part of your late game win condition, where you're not taking knockouts, you're instead setting up a full prize swing of Burning Darkness, thanks to your counter placement as well. So I think there's so much flexibility with the deck. Still quite a complicated one, but I think it really underperformed my expectation at Worlds, to be honest with you. The risk is that you're not great into Dusknoir, of course, and that's, yeah, admittedly quite a quite an awkward situation to have, but I do think there's a lot going for this archetype and should be being played more at regionals. In at number 1 then, Gholdengo has really overtaken the format. So consistent, so good at imposing its strategy, forcing its way through multiple prize knockouts. And at Worlds we saw many of the players, the top performers, go for ways to improve your prize race, be it with redeemable ticket Academy at Night Chansey, all the Togekiss, all the Ceruledge Briar, there's all sorts of ways to force your way through a 3-attack game plan after representing a single prize board. And fundamentally, that's just such a good place to be in, knowing that it takes you so little to get into games now with Genesect, after using Buddy Poffin for some gimmies. It's just so straightforward to get into games, and as soon as you get your Gholdengo, you start seeing so many cards that you can be hard to stop and hard to disrupt, ultimately making it a really strong performer. That's why even some of the weaker matchups aren't that terrible. You're still always in with a chance with Gholdengo by the looks of things. I do think the Iron Hands Dengo is going to be a problem for you, and it does look like Charizard's awkward as well as a straight Dragapult. You are balanced into Dragadusk, Flareon, Raging Bolt, Zoro, and Tera Box, but you have that big boast of being strong into Gardevoir, strong into Grimm, strong into Dragazard, and also strong into Joltik Box from the data. So a lot going for Gholdengo, honestly. Very consistent performer. That's why it's on top, I think, right now. It did get a top 8 placements at the World Championships in the hands of Piper. A very straightforward list, ultimately, but it did have that 101 Togekiss package, and that's really what I was mentioning, that having that Wonderkiss available allows you to play around walling
Mons a little bit more effectively, because every time you knock out a non-walling Pokemon, like a Bench Monkey Dory or something else, you can sometimes coin flip and gain additional prizes for it. Same thing for Toedscruel. It actually means that you can gust a Toedscruel, knock it out. Even if you don't hit heads on the Toedscruel knockout itself, it means that next turn you have another chance, because very often your opponent can't target the Togekiss. It ruins their own prize map if they take a single prizer in a ton of situations. So it gives you a second coin flip to take a 3-prize knockout and a 2-prizer to still win the game. And I think with the Quad Cypher, especially, that Piper's gone with, it's giving herself a really good chance of getting that Togekiss up by the time you're, or ahead of the second knockout that you take. I think a lot of the time you do your first Make It Rain by using ESP, then with your Draw Power and Cypher, you try and get Togekiss prepped for your second and third knockouts, and hopefully among those two attacks, you're going to be winning the game with just one heads flip. Of course, there's going to be a ton of situations where you don't even need Togekiss and the opponent's prize map is laid out for you and you can just go bossing his orders instead. But I think this Togekiss gives you avenues to beat the tech cards, which I think is very powerful, and also beat the mirror as well, allowing you to strike it rich with your initial Gholdengo, take the 1, and feel pretty happy about that situation as well. Or do the opposite, make it rain early, knowing the opponent can take a 2-prize knockout, but then you can set up Togekiss and still win in 2 attacks from there without much issue either. I think the only things I'd like to change from Piper's list is flip-flop the Cypher and Arven back, because I still think Arven's slightly superior, at least in the opening turns, of course, where it's just an extra consistency choice. And I think Arston versus Levincia is a real question. With the amount of Dengo around, I think you can get away with one Levincia and have the extra ball search card, but I think it could just be second Levincia, to be honest with you. I think that's like still a solid choice. But yeah, really good list from Piper. Very happy to see it. And I think Togekiss does cover a lot of the tech inclusions that you're going to come up against. That's it then. That's the top 10 decks from the Black Bolt White Flare expansion. Hopefully you're smashing your locals and prepared for the regionals upcoming. I'm so excited to get involved in the 2026 season. I'm going to be at the Frankfurt Regional Championships, getting involved in the action as well. So can't wait for that. Good luck to everyone heading into those tournaments, and we'll be back soon for another top 10. Cheers.